So the summer of 2023, a couple years ago. This was the first summer after my wife and I also got married. We got married that winter before that. And so it was a summer that was full of a lot of newness for us. We did a lot of fun, exciting activities together. And one of the things that we did together was we went on a canoe camping trip, which is something that I'd been doing for years with friends and family. And I've always loved canoe camping. And I was really excited to share it with her. And so one weekend in that summer, we packed up the car, drove up to the Adirondacks, loaded up our canoe, and started paddling. And the place where we went to camp, the place that the campsites were, was you had to paddle across this big lake that you started in, and then you had to portage, which means you had to carry your stuff over to a river close by, canoe up the river, and then into a second lake, and that's where the campsites were. So after a couple hours, we had been paddling for a while. It was getting close to lunchtime. We were getting a little hungry, and we were on that second lake looking for that perfect campsite. And we realized pretty quickly that this happened to be a pretty busy weekend on the lake that we were going to camp in. And so we passed the first campsite and the next campsite. The first few that we passed were full. We did pass one that was empty, but we looked at it, and it was like, we could tell it was not the perfect site for us. So we said, okay, let's keep looking. So we crossed the lake to another portion of the lake, and we found 3 more campsites, also full. By this point, we're getting pretty hungry. It's like time for a late lunch, and we canoed a little extra time that we didn't expect we were going to. And so we wanted to pass over to another part of the lake to look for a campsite over there. And on the way over, we passed that one empty campsite that we passed earlier in the day. And also was like, hey, babe, you want to just stop here and set up? This looks fine. And I was like, no, this isn't the perfect campsite for us. So we kept looking. We kept on going to the other part of the lake, and we just kept running into campsite after campsite after campsite that were full. And some of them looked empty, but when we got closer, they were full. And so it was getting pretty late in the day. We were getting pretty hungry. And when it was all said and done, we canoed out around the entire lake. It was like 6 extra miles. I'm not kidding. Looking for that perfect site. And they were all full. And at one point, I saw a spot that I thought looked like it could be good. So I went to go beach the canoe. I was like, this could be it. And as we get close to beaching, I hear from the front of the boat. And I hear also go, nope, push off. We're not stopping here, leave. And I was looking in the woods, what's happening? Is there a bear? Is there a mountain lion? Is she injured? And come to find out, there was, in front of the boat on the shore, there was a spider. And I think Elsa described it as ginormous repeatedly. We had a lively debate about this spider, and after all was said and done, we ended up not stopping at this spot. And it was getting late in the day at this point. We were tired, we were irritated, we were hungry, we just wanted to be somewhere, find somewhere to camp. And so we had no other option than to go back to that first campsite that we saw that was open. So we went back, beached it, set up camp, and guys, we ended up actually having a really nice time there. We had a glowing fire, also made some delicious, chicken or something on the fire. We casted the fishing rods unsuccessfully. We spent all that day looking for what I thought the perfect campsite was going to look like for our trip. And after all that, we ended up having a wonderful evening at a site that was in front of us the whole time. As I think back on that camping trip, I realize, I can do that a lot in life. I can invest a lot of emotional energy into looking for big peak moments or experiences in the way that I think they should look like. So I look forward to vacations and holidays, and I set my expectations really high. I think, this vacation is going to be where we make our lifelong memories as a family. Or I look forward to a holiday coming up, and I think this is going to be a peak experience for us. But then if it falls short of my expectations, which if they're really high, it usually does, or if something doesn't go as planned, then I get really disappointed and I feel like I've missed out. Sometimes we can think about God the way that we think about peak experiences or peak moments in life. So what I mean is we can set expectations of what we think it should look like when God shows up in our life. Especially when we're going through something hard. We can set expectations that, okay, God's going to show up like this. He's going to help me in what I'm going through, and it will look like something that I have in my mind, and he'll help me, or he'll change the situation. But sometimes when we're going through something that's particularly lonely or some great loss, it can feel like God's just not showing up. It can feel like God's just not showing up. So what do? Well, sometimes the way that God shows up, sometimes the way that he shows us that he does care about what we're going through and shows us kindness and love when things get hard or lonely is through things that don't look like we expect. But that's hard when it gets lonely. Maybe you live alone, or maybe your kids have left the house, or your house is quiet, and just there's a lot of weeks that go by, and you don't feel like you spend as much quality time with people as you'd like to. And you see other people that seem like they're busy, and they have families, and they have friends, or they have jobs, and their life is moving forward. And sometimes it can be really hard and challenging to feel like you're surrounded by people who are busy and have lives that are moving forward, and you feel like you're sitting on the sidelines. And it can feel really lonely to feel like you're forgotten. But you don't have to be alone to feel lonely. Have you been broken up with? Or have you had a close friendship that's deteriorated for some reason? You know that you can be surrounded by friends and still feel a pit in your stomach. Maybe it's somebody that's passed away, that you loved dearly. That can be such a lonely thing. I remember when my grandfather died a few years ago. That was so heartbreaking for me. It felt so lonely to lose somebody that I loved so much. And I remember in that time, I looked for God a lot. I prayed to him a lot and asked him for help and told him how I was feeling. But I also remember just feeling like I was searching for God, but it was lonely and it still just hurt. When we're going through something lonely, we're going through loss, we can think, well, if I pray, if I tell God how I feel and ask him for help, then he should show up like this. He should help me and change something. But what do we do if that doesn't happen? If we have some expectation of what that should look like, and it feels like he doesn't come through? Well, sometimes the way that God comes through, the way that he shows us that he cares, is in ways that look different than we expect. And what we read about this morning in this next chapter in Ruth is that sometimes the way that God meets us in our lonely, hard circumstances is through things that look ordinary on the surface and maybe don't necessarily change our situation the way we think that it should. So not last week, 3 weeks ago, we started this series in this book of Ruth. Ruth is a true story about a woman named Naomi who has to move from where she lives in Israel to a different country Moab, because they're facing a famine, which means that they don't have any food. They're starving. So she moves with her husband and her sons because they're starving. And then after she moves, her husband dies. And then her sons also die. And then one of her daughters-in-law leaves her. And we finished off leaving in Ruth with Naomi and her last remaining family member, her daughter-in-law Ruth, returning to Israel. Naomi is bitter and she's broken. And she's blaming God. Remember, she said at the end of chapter 1 that God had made her life very bitter. So chapter 1 is full of tragedy. And we heard that from Josh. I don't know if I can. Chapter 1 is full of tragedy. It's big. It's sad. It's devastating. And then we move into chapter 2, and what we see is a story that starts with a day that looks kind of ordinary. Here's what I mean. At the beginning of the story, it starts with Ruth, the Moabite. She says to Naomi, her mother-in-law, "Let me go into the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." What she's doing here, what she's talking about, there's a name for this. It's called gleaning. It's an idea that God invented back in Leviticus chapter 19, when he was giving Israel their laws for the whole country. He was telling them how they were going to live as a country. And one of the laws that he gave them was to farmers. He said, basically, farmers, when you're harvesting your fields, don't go over the field more than once. So anything that you drop accidentally or any pieces that you miss, Leave them behind, go over at once. And the reason is so that people who are poor or homeless or foreigners can come to your fields after you're done harvesting, and they can pick up those leftovers, and that's how they can be provided for. So when when Ruth asks Naomi if she can go into the fields and glean, this is an ordinary thing. This is what's expected of her to do. It'd be like if somebody here in the capital region, somebody poor, said that they were going to go to the city mission to get a meal. It's ordinary. It's normal. So she ends up in Boaz's field, and Boaz shows up, which makes sense because he owns the field. And this is harvest time. So he's showing up to see how things are going, to see how the harvest is going. And he notices there's somebody that he doesn't recognize there. So he asks about her and finds out, she is Naomi's daughter-in-law. And Naomi is his relative, like one of his cousins. And so he decides that he's going to be very generous with her and give her a gift. Give her some extra food. He tells her, like, hey, you can stay and you can glean here. You'll be safe. And he invites her to share a meal with them that day. And then he sends her home with a gift of food. So that's what kind of happens in this portion of the story. That's what goes on. But then when Ruth goes home to Naomi, remember, she tells Naomi what happened. And how does Naomi react? She's overjoyed. She's so excited about it. Isn't that kind of weird? Because just in the last chapter, at the end of chapter 1, she was talking about how devastated she was. Remember, she said, "The Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." Because of the things that she had gone through, devastating things. And now, because she's gotten a gift of some extra food, total heart transformation. She's overjoyed. Why is that? What causes that in her? Well, look what she says in her response. She saw the gift and she said, "He, God, has not stopped showing his kindness." God has not stopped showing his kindness. Before this, Naomi was in a place of believing that God was against her because of the things that she was going through. Remember, she said that he had made her life bitter, that he had brought her back empty. And she was empty. Sometimes when we read stories in the Bible, they sound matter of fact, and we can lose the emotion of what Naomi is going through. Like, she moved out of Israel because they were starving. And she moved away with a husband, with sons who married women. Like, she had a family, she had a future. And now she's coming back to Israel, and her family has died. All she has left is Ruth. She has no family. She has no future. She doesn't even have any food. And God shows up by giving her the simple gift of kindness in this part of the story. The simple gift to show her that he does see her and that he does care. That's what Naomi needed that day, was to be reminded that God cared about her. Maybe that's what you need today. Do you find it hard to believe sometimes that God actually really cares about the thing that you're going through? That he actually sees you and cares? Well, if you feel like that sometimes, and you feel like that because you're searching for God and asking him for help in certain ways, and it feels like he's not showing up, then I want to encourage you from this portion of our story in Ruth, like Naomi, maybe we need to change our perspective and look for God in the ordinary. Look for God in the ordinary. Listen, whether you're going through it right now or in the future when you do feel alone or forgotten, look for God in the ordinary. When's the last time you were encouraged by something that was simple and kind and ordinary? I think we know that feeling, right? Like if you've had a baby, like many of you have recently, and those meal trains, those are such a blessing to get dinner provided by somebody else. Really encouraging. And having a baby, there's a lot of joy in that, but there can be also some loneliness in that and some feelings of isolation. And so that can help you to feel just loved and seen. Or something really simple, like if you're just having a hard morning and you come here to Fireside and somebody just goes out of their way to see you and say hi to you and listen to how your day's going. Or you come in and Gladys gives you like a warm hug. And that just feels good. Or when somebody does something thoughtful to serve you in a way that's just ordinary. Like the other day we were here setting up early for rehearsal, and Michelle treated a few of us to Starbucks. And that was just like, oh, that was simple, but that was really, really kind and impactful. That was ordinary, but it was encouraging, you know? I think we know the feeling of being blessed by something that's simple and ordinary by somebody. And the truth is that God is the one who uses ordinary, simple things to show his kindness and to show that he cares. So look for God in those ordinary things. You might be here thinking, okay, Paul, I hear you, but chapter 2, it's not like exactly ordinary, or it's like, in other words, it's not exactly random, right? It's clear there's something deeper going on here. Like, for instance, in the beginning of the chapter, the very first verse, it mentions Boaz. Before he even shows up on the scene, he says, hey, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So that's like a clue as we're reading the story. Like, ooh, pay attention to Boaz. There's something special about Boaz. And then later on, after Ruth comes home and she's talking to Naomi, Naomi says about Boaz, she says, hey, that man, Boaz, he's one of our close relatives. He's one of our guardian redeemers. Real quick, just if you don't know what that term guardian redeemers means, it was a custom, it's referring to a custom that they had back then when if a family got into trouble, like if in this case, when the man of the family died, it was expected that another close relative of that family would come alongside the family, would help them, would buy their land from them to keep it from being sold off to strangers, and in a lot of cases would marry the widow of that man so that the family could continue to have children. And so when we read this chapter, we can see, oh, something's happening here. This isn't random. God is clearly arranging the pieces of this story. We can see that by reading it. And maybe part of the reason for that is also because we're reading the Bible, and we know that it's a story about God. And so every story, like the narrator doesn't mention Boaz, or I'm sorry, doesn't mention God, but every story reading the Bible, we look at it and we're like, well, where's God in this? Where's God in this? He's supposed to be in it. It's the Bible. So we can see that. It's really obvious. And maybe Ruth and Naomi could see that looking back. But that doesn't change the fact that put in their shoes, in this story, all they had that day was Boaz's his gift, his simple act of kindness to them. You know, and that was enough. That was enough. And for us, if we are looking for God in the ordinary, that's just going to put us in a much better position to be able to see him, to see his kindness in ways that we might otherwise miss, because it might look different than we expect. Look for God in the ordinary. And I promise you, he'll remind you, like he reminded Ruth and Naomi, that he does see you. He does care about what you're going through. God has not stopped showing his kindness to you. You know, earlier when I mentioned that I have this habit of setting huge expectations for things like holidays. Well, this past Christmas was our first Christmas with our daughter, Ellie. She was only a month old at the time. And from well before she was born, Elsa and I talked a lot about how amazing this Christmas was going to be with our little girl, with our little baby. You know, we dreamed about it. We planned. We bought her stocking. We made ornaments for her. We were so excited. And then the day before Christmas Eve, she actually got a fever. And we had to take her to the ER to get it checked out. And it turned out that they weren't able to determine what was causing it in their first round of testing that they do. And we ended up having to stay in the hospital 3 days through Christmas. So there we are, sitting in the hospital with Ellie. And I'm struggling because all of the things that I thought our Christmas with our little girl was going to look like weren't going to happen. We didn't have a tree. We weren't going to go see my family for Christmas dinner. We weren't going to get our perfect family photos, you know, and that felt lonely. Our family came to see us, but it still felt lonely to be missing out like that. So I'm having a really hard time with this, and at one point a nurse comes in, and she has a red bag, and she hands it to me, and she says, Merry Christmas. And I open it up, and inside there's this miniature Christmas tree and a string of Christmas lights and a little ornament that said, My First Christmas. It was really sweet. And I'm looking at this, and it just hits me, and I look up at Elsa with tears in my eyes. And she just looks down at Ellie, and she said, Hey, Merry Christmas, Ellie. And I start setting this stuff up, and from that moment, something was different. You know, it was like there was a little more hope there. There was a little bit less anxiety over the situation. It didn't allow us to go home. It didn't make Ellie feel better. It didn't really change the situation, and we had other gifts that we were planning on giving and receiving at home too. Probably ones that were more expensive. That gift was probably only $50. But in that moment, the Lord used that cheap little gift to give me what I needed, which was just a reminder that he saw what we were going through and that he cared. Yeah. Look for God in the ordinary. The cool thing is, the more that we look for God in the ordinary, the more the things in life that are ordinary are going to seem so ordinary, because we're going to get better and better at seeing Jesus in the things around us. When Jesus was here, he had a big mission, right? Rescuing the world. But he spent a lot of time with people, caring about people, loving people, helping people who needed it. And then sometimes that was in big ways, right? Sometimes that was making blind people see or bringing dead people back to life. But sometimes it was in ordinary ways, like crying with a friend or giving somebody a meal who was hungry. And he's the same today, guys. He hasn't changed. And he's not here in person, but now he uses each other to show that kindness to you. He uses your ordinary circumstances to do the same thing. So go to Jesus. Tell him what you're feeling. Spill your heart out before him. Tell him what you're going through and ask him for help. And then look for him in the ordinary things. And you'll see more and more of him. And that will be, I promise you, you'll be encouraged by that. Let's pray.